It's time for Fresh Oil with singer-songwriter and pastor Keith Manley. A program designed to minister the gospel of God's grace and to bring fresh oil to the brokenhearted. And now, with today's program, Pastor Keith Manley.
Welcome to Fresh Oil, the daily radio broadcast that believes the best days of your life and God are not behind you, they're ahead of you, friend. God said in Psalm 92, I shall be anointed with fresh oil, that we will still bear fruit in our old age. I'm Pastor Keith, and I'm so glad you joined me today because we're beginning one of the most unusual, and I promise you, one of the most powerful series we've ever done on this program. I want to ask you a question before we even open up the scripture. Have you ever read the first chapter of Matthew? Not studied it, not preached it, just read it. And if you have, you know that it begins with what sounds like the world's most tedious exercise in name dropping. Abraham begat Isaac, Isaac begat Jacob, Jacob begat Judah and his brothers. And it goes on like that for 17 verses, and most people just skip it. Commentaries even often skip it. Preachers almost universally skip it and go straight into the Christmas story. But I want to tell you today, and for the next 5 days on Fresh Oil, that those 17 verses contain 5 of the most extraordinary, scandalous, and theologically profound stories in all of Scripture. Because embedded in that list of patriarchs is a genealogical record that by all the conventions of the ancient world should contain nothing but male names. And yet embedded within this genealogical record are 5 names of 5 women. And every single one of them was the kind of woman that polite religious society would have kept out of the story. Today we begin with the first of those 5 women, and her name is Tamar, perhaps the most scandalous of them all. Matthew chapter 1 and verse 3 says this, Judah begat Perez, and Zerah by Tamar. That's the only mention she gets in the entire New Testament. Just her name, just a lineage note, but her story, her full story, it fills an entire chapter in Genesis. And it's one of the most raw, uncomfortable, ultimately redemptive narratives in all of the whole Old Testament. Now, we're in the book of Genesis, chapter 38, and it's the patriarchal period. Judah, one of the 12 sons of Jacob, one of the founding fathers of the 12 tribes of Israel, he's moved away from his brothers, and he settled among the Canaanites. He married a Canaanite woman, and they had 3 sons, Er, Onan, and Shelah. And Judah arranged for his firstborn son, Er, to marry a Canaanite woman named Tamar. Now stop right there and recognize what you've already been told. Tamar is a Canaanite. She's not born into the covenant family. She has no natural claim to the promises of Abraham. She has no standing in the covenant community except through her marriage. She is, from the very beginning, an outsider who has been let through a door that she did not build. The Bible tells us in Genesis chapter 38 and verse 7 that Tamar's husband, was wicked in the sight of the Lord. The Hebrew word for wicked here is the word ra, and it's not a mild word. This is not simply making poor decisions or having a bad temper. That word ra, in its deepest sense, describes a moral corruption that is incompatible with the purposes of God. The text doesn't tell us specifically what did, but it tells us that the Lord put him to death. And so Tamar is now a widow. She's young, she's childless, she's displaced with no children to inherit and no status in the household. Now, under the ancient law of what scholars call the Levirate marriage, comes from the Latin word levir, which means brother-in-law. In this ancient practice in the Hebrew law, when a man died without a son, it was the sacred obligation of the next surviving brother to take the widow as his wife and to raise up children in the dead brother's name. They would name the firstborn child after the brother that had died. And that union would legally carry the dead man's name and his inheritance, so his portion would transfer to his family. This was not merely a social custom. This was a covenant protection for widows that God designed. And so the inheritance line would go on, and it mattered. It was woven into the fabric of how God intended his people to function. So Judah gave Tamar to his second son, Onan. And Onan knew that the child born of that union would not be counted as his, so he refused to fulfill his covenant duty. The text says he spilled his seed on the ground, and so that he would not give offspring to his brother. And God was so displeased with Onan that he also died. Wow. Now Tamar is widowed twice bereaved, and Judah has one more son left, Shelah, who is still young. And by law, by covenant, by every obligation of his family and his faith, Judah should give Shelah to Tamar when the boy comes of age. Judah tells Tamar, "Remain a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah is grown." But Judah was afraid. He had lost 2 sons, and in his grief and his fear, he had begun wrongfully, unfairly, but humanly, to associate Tamar with their deaths, and he sent her away with the promise that he had no intention of keeping. Now, I want you to feel the weight of Tamar's situation for just a moment. She's not just disappointed, she's legally stranded. In the ancient world, a widow without children and without a clear future in her husband's family was among the most vulnerable people in society. She can't simply go find another husband. She's technically bound to the Levirate obligation. She has to wait for a brother-in-law who's never coming. So she's waiting in her father's house, wearing the garments of a widow, and the man who should provide for her future has lied to her face. She waited for Shelah to grow up. She waited while nothing happened. She waited until it became undeniable that Judah was not going to keep his word. And then she did something that has divided commentators for centuries. She heard that Judah was traveling to Timnah for the sheep shearing, which in the ancient world was a festival occasion, a time of celebration and relatively looseness of social structure. So she removed her widow's garments, those public, visible garments of grief that marked her status to the whole community. And she veiled herself, and she sat by the road at a place called Enaim, which in Hebrew means the opening of the eyes. And when Judah passed by, he assumed she was a cult prostitute. In Hebrew, it's a word dedicated to a Canaanite temple practice. And he didn't recognize his own daughter-in-law. He propositioned her. And Tamar, still veiled, asked what he would give her. And Judah offered to send a young goat from his flock. She said, "Give me a pledge until you send it." And she asked for 3 things: his signet ring, his cord, and his staff. Now, in ancient Near East, a man's signet ring was his personal seal. It bore his name, and it authenticated his transactions. They would use it to authenticate documents. It was his identity in the legal commercial world. His cord bore his tribal markings, and then his staff represented his authority. So to give these things to a stranger was to give her everything she would need to identify him. Tamar was not being impulsive. She was being strategic. She was being wise. She had thought this through. She took the pledge, and Judah lay with her, and she conceived. And when Judah sent the young goat by his friend to retrieve his pledge, no one could find the woman. There was no such woman at that place. His friend was told. Judah dropped the matter rather than be publicly embarrassed. 3 months later, Judah was told, "Your daughter-in-law Tamar has played the harlot, and she's pregnant by her harlotry." And Judah, the man who had himself just visited what he believed to be a prostitute, the man who had lied to Tamar for years, the man who had withheld his youngest son Shelah from her, Judah responded with a meek moral outrage. He said, bring her out and let her be burned. Death by fire for the daughter-in-law he had already betrayed. And then Tamar did something that took more courage than almost anything else in the entire story. She sent a message to Jacob. She didn't come out publicly. She didn't shame him before the crowd. She sent him the signet ring and the cord and the staff. And she said, by the man to whom these belong, I am with child. Please discern whose these are, the signet and the cord and the staff. Please discern. Not an accusation, but an invitation to honesty. And Judah, to his eternal credit, he said 6 words that I believe were probably the most spiritually honest words he ever spoke in his life. She is more righteous than I. In Hebrew, it comes out as, she has been right and I have been wrong. She is more righteous than I, because I did not give her my son, Shelah. Wow. Amazing. And you know what? Tamar bore twins, Perez and Zerah. There is even more drama in the delivery. Zerah put out his hand first, and the midwife tied a scarlet thread on his wrist to mark him as the firstborn. And then he pulled his hand back, and Perez came out first. Perez, whose name means breakthrough, pushed through. And it is through Perez that the line runs. Perez to Hezron, and Hezron to Ram, to Abinadab, to Nahshon, to Salmon, to Boaz, to Obed, to Jesse, to David, and from David eventually to Joseph, the legal father of Jesus of Nazareth. See, the Messiah came through Tamar's breakthrough. Now let me tell you what I believe this story is doing in the genealogy of Christ, and what it has to say to you today. First, God is making a statement about covenant faithfulness. Tamar understood something Judah had abandoned. The covenant mattered. The line mattered. The obligation was real, and she held to it when the person most responsible for keeping it had walked away. She didn't give up on the covenant, even when the covenant keeper did. Secondly, God is making a statement about righteousness. Judah had all the title and all the position. He was a patriarch. He was a covenant son. And the woman he nearly had executed, the foreign woman, twice widowed, was declared by his own mouth to be more righteous than he was. You see, friend, God has a long habit of finding the righteousness he needs in places the religious establishment has already written off. And then finally, third, this is the word that I believe God has for someone listening right now. Tamar's long wait was not wasted. The years in her father's house, wearing the garments of widowhood, holding on to a promise that had been broken, God had not forgotten any of it. And when the moment came when she was ready, she still had the courage to act, the wisdom to act carefully, and the dignity to give Judah the chance to be honest before she publicly exposed him. Now, tomorrow we're going to be talking about Rahab.
What if the family tree of Jesus wasn't filled with perfect people, but broken, scandal-marked, courageous women? In The Genealogy of Hope, 5 women who changed everything, author Keith Manley brings to life the powerful stories of Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba, and Mary. 5 unlikely women woven into the lineage of Christ. A woman who risked everything for justice. A prostitute who chose faith over fear. A foreigner who found redemption. A grieving mother who carried sorrow. And a teenage girl who said yes to the impossible. This is not a genealogy of perfection, it's a genealogy of hope. Discover how God writes straight with crooked lines, and how your story can be redeemed too. The Genealogy of Hope by Keith Manley.
Check out my new book, The Genealogy of Hope, available now on Amazon.com in hardcover, paperback, or the Kindle ebook.
Thanks for joining us today for Fresh Oil with Pastor Keith Manley. Fresh Oil is an outreach of Grace Family Church in Rockford, Illinois, and can be heard each weekday at this same time. You can reach us online at weneedgod.com. Until next time, remember, God's love for you is unconditional, and He makes His mercies new every morning.